for the introduction. I do need a Panado, but for different reasons, I have a cold, unfortunately. So please bear with me as I wipe my nose and probably take some breaks while I'm speaking. So thank you so much. Thank you to Melissa for inviting me. I think that's fine. All right, that's fine, right? You can hear me? Thank you to Melissa for inviting me. I have been teaching, so I'm sorry I couldn't attend, but I'm very excited to be here today and also to listen to the other talks that are given. So my talk is called White Lies on Whiteness, Ignorance, and Disavowal, and I think there'll be some times for questions. I don't think I'll take the whole 45 minutes, but I might, who knows? So ignorance, as this very conference attests, has become a popular object of study across disciplinary as well as national boundaries. While this is not necessarily problematic, the focus on ignorance becomes worrisome when ignorance is linked to innocence, as is the case in a significant body of scholarship on whiteness. We must not take for granted that philosopher Charles Mills's theory of white ignorance has become a dominant frame for understanding white epistemology and is popular especially among white scholars. First developed in Mills's classic study, The Racial Contract, the theory of white ignorance stipulates that ignorance is the principal frame through which we are to understand the relationship between white people's ways of knowing with regard to racism. Mills argues that on matters relative to race and racism, white people exhibit, quote, an inverted epistemology, an epistemology of ignorance, end of quote. Mills views this epistemology, which he calls white ignorance, as a ubiquitous kind of ignorance produced through racial domination. Citing Moody Duane, Mills argues that white people, quote, exhibit a general inability to perceive the persistence of discrimination and the effects of more subtle forms of institutional discrimination. This presumes that white people are generally ignorant about racial domination and therefore innocent. Is this working fine? I hear a noise. Is it okay? Okay. The liking of whiteness and innocence is not the sole prerogative of Mills, however. Rather, a significant body of philosophical scholarship in particular represents white people as passive and therefore innocent bystanders in a system of racial domination, scholarship by white scholars predominantly. For example, in The Oppressor's Pathology, published in 2010, philosopher Pedro Tabensky constructs what Robin Wiegman calls a mutuality of harm hypotheses between Black and white people, as he argues that, quote, the dynamic of oppressor and oppressed creates widespread psychological damage on both sides of the oppressive divide, typically making both oppressor and oppressed into psychological cripples, end of quote. The thin line between creating an equivalence between Black and white people and portraying white people as victims of racism is quickly crossed in Tabensky's essay. Racism, according to Tabensky, is something that white people, quote, suffer from, as they are, quote, best described as the victims of bad habits, relatively thinly conceived, instilled in them by the air of their times, end of quote. The portrayal of white people as suffering from racism, where racism is understood as merely an individualized question of bad habits, serves to relinquish white responsibility for racism and silence its institutionalization. White people are literally reduced to puppets without agency in this white scholarship. We are not just constructed as innocent, but also as people who are subjected to racism in a perverse reversal of power. Tabensky argues that, quote, white oppressors, not solely those who are militantly committed to oppressing others, are alienated from the world and from themselves, making their behavior seem like that of soulless dolls, end of quote. Representing white people as alienated, as soulless dolls, takes away agency from white people, reducing us to beings who do not know what we are doing, even when we actively oppress Black people. Again, Tabensky's colorblind moves are not original. US philosopher Shannon Sullivan also conceives white people as being, quote, constructed by something unconscious or preconscious habits, something outside of their control, or something external to them, as in rephrasing the white privileged world. Here, basically, the world acts like the weather, right? You're just born into this world privileged, and that's pretty much it. South African philosopher Samantha Weiss similarly writes, because of the brute facts of birth, few white people, however well-meaning and morally conscientious, will escape the habits of white privilege. Their characters and modes of interaction with the world will just be constituted in ways that are morally damaging, end of quote. In this analysis, white people do not co-constitute the world, but are seemingly at its mercy. Even as what continues to perpetuate whiteness is white people's active investment in maintaining economic, political, and symbolic power, and our disavowal of this power. In my work, I challenge the dominant argument that white people are innocent bystanders that do not understand the world that we have made. Instead, I support Frantz Fanon's claim that, quote, a social group, a country, a civilization cannot be unconsciously racist, end of quote. While ignorance in Mills's understanding implies both false belief, error, and lack of true belief, ignorance, and need not be based on bad faith, white people's ongoing investment in this avowal of white supremacy shows that racism, as Lewis Gordon would say, is not a matter of ignorance, but of bad faith. It is necessary to distinguish between white ignorance and the oral or textual performance of ignorance, but white people use to hide our knowledge of and global investment in racial domination. As white people who strategically pretend to be ignorant as a tactic of domination. Alongside the concept of unconscious bias, the theory of white ignorance has gained much traction in US academia and beyond. It is my contention that scholars should rethink both. For once, Afro-pessimist thinkers have argued that there is no such a thing as a generally colorblind unconscious. In the first place, given that, as Frank B. Roderson writes, quote, Black people form a mass of undistinguishable flesh in the collective unconscious, end of quote. The global popularity of racial disavowal among white people demonstrates the centrality of white knowledge, that is, the impact of white racial consciousness onto the production of white academic, legal, and popular knowledge itself. White people silence racism not because we are ignorant, but because we understand that racism benefits us immensely. To protect these benefits, we disavow the differential value attributed to the lives of Black people and white people that is endemic in former European settler colonies in Europe. Everywhere, white violence is accompanied by unabated racial inequality, as white people continue to own most of the world's resources and wealth, including through neocolonial organizations that have deceptive names such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, right? It's the World Bank, not the European American Bank. It sits in Washington, D.C. In the United States, white people have concrete material advantages over Black people and people of color in every aspect of life, from wealth to income, housing, education, incarceration levels, and life expectancy. The median white U.S. household had over $111,000 in wealth holdings in 2011, while the median Black household had only around $7,000. This massive racial inequality, of course, is not a U.S. peculiarity. In Brazil, Black people on average earned 42% less than white people in 2015. Rampant racial inequality affects Black Brazilians' very chance to reach adulthood. Black infant mortality in the Southeast, one of the poorest regions in Brazil, is 52.7% per thousand children born alive, while it is 30.9 per thousand white children born alive. In Italy, where I'm from, by the way, Institutional racism also systematically subjects Black people to harrowing living conditions, economic exploitation, police violence, lack of access to adequate education and housing, as well as discrimination in the workplace, judicial system, and prison system. In South Africa, as we know, Black majority rule has not brought improvements in living conditions for most people. White people who are just 8.9% of the South African population in the 2011 census owned 87% of the land in 1997 and continue to own over 70% of the land in the vast majority of the country's wealth today. I think it's telling that even statistics about how much land white people are actually owning are hard to come by, right? The racially differential life expectancy also powerfully reveals the enduring reality of anti-Blackness in South Africa, where life expectancy for Black people has decreased from 60 years in 1985 to merely 49 years in 2004. Black people have some of the lowest life expectancy in the world in this country, while for white people, the life expectancy is over 70 years. But of course, the government no longer collects disaggregated life expectancy statistics disaggregated by race. So when I ask my students what is the life expectancy in South Africa, they say 62, right? So I think this also speaks volumes about the institutionalization of color blindness in South Africa, right? Even the government is no longer letting us know how little Black people are living and how differential the life expectancy is across racial boundaries in this country, as it's in the US as well, and pretty much, every country in which white people live. So racial regimes do structurally produce ignorance, but racial inequality is not simply or predominantly maintained through ignorance, but rather through the camouflage, disavowal, and denial of white dominance itself on the part of white people. Checking the time. This argument challenges common sense understandings of racism itself. Many scholars of race have argued that we are faced with a new racial era, one of colorblind racism or cultural racism, in which racism has gone underground, is obfuscated, is disavowed, or is outright denied. However, this obsession with newness and with distinguishing the racism of the present from the racism of the past does not allow us to understand either the history or the ongoing workings of racism. In fact, disavowal, dissimulation, and denialism are not a contemporary phenomenon or a phenomenon of the post-World War II era simply, but define the colonial project from the beginning. Colonialism was not advertised for the genocidal enterprise that it was. Rather, as Emmett Césaire writes in Discourse on Colonialism, Europeans disavowed their intent to kill and plunder, disguising imperial conquest as Christianization and civilization. White people made enslavement, genocide, and theft disappear through rhetorical gestures, which argued that colonization was, quote, about progress, about achievements, diseases cured, improved standards of living, end of quote. With no regard for fact or logic, lands populated by millions of people were declared terra nullius, no man's land. A continent that had been inhabited for at least 14,000 years was proclaimed discovered and named the New World. And millions of people belonging to different ethnic groups unilaterally became Indians. People literally born in death, as without genocide, as Wilderson writes, quote, Indians would not paradoxically exist. To legitimize the domination over non-European peoples, as well as Europeans whom they deemed other, such as Slavs and Jews, Europeans invented the idea of race. So the idea of race, as I understand it, is itself structured in disavowal, right? Racialization functions as a dissimulation mechanism that makes relationships that are created and constructed through colonialism and violence appear natural. And it conceals its own workings by operating through categories other than race. For example, Europeans early on devised a systematic division of labor in the American colonies that conferred waged labor only to white people. Labor was racialized in order to make the race and class associations seem natural as a mechanism of white domination. Spatial segregation further ensured that the vast majority of the land, resources, and jobs would remain in white hands to this day. The European construct of the Negro, quote unquote, is also a fabrication grounded not in ignorance but in disavowal. Instead of admitting to the scandal of kidnapping and selling human beings and the hypocrisy of doing so with the backing and the money of the Catholic Church, Europeans appropriated for themselves the category human. They argued that only white people are fully human and therefore capable of rational thought, historicity, and change, while they confined Black people to what Fanon calls a zone of non-being. This twofold process is co-constitutive, given that humanness, as Rinaldo Walcott writes, is defined against Black being. It is not that white people were simply ignorant about the African civilizations that they colonized and enslaved, but rather that they disavowed their knowledge about them as a tool of conquest. Speaking to this phenomenon, Cedric Robinson writes in Black Marxism that, quote, the construct of Negro, unlike the terms African, Moor, or Ethiopi, suggested no situatedness in time, that is history or space, that is ethno or political geography. The Negro had no civilization, no cultures, no religions, no history, no place, and finally no humanity that might command consideration, end of quote. This construct, Robinson makes clear, was not the product of white ignorance. Europeans had known for centuries that Africans lived in complex societies, but they disavowed this fact. Please excuse me. Oh, wow. So Europeans had known for centuries that Africans lived in complex societies, but they disavowed this fact. It is my contention that it is not possible to understand racism and much less white epistemology outside these standardized white practices of disavowing, projecting, stereotyping, masking, appropriating, suppressing, and outright lying. White people have always attempted to match the racist infrastructure while actively recreating it through violence. If we are to understand white epistemology, we need to return to the early days of colonial conquest. We need to go back to Rino Johannes van der Riet's portrayal of the Khoisan in the Cape Colony. The Landros of Stellenbosch, van der Riet relied extensively on camouflage and disavowal to argue in defense of the enslavement of Khoena children. In my book, I call these tactics colorblind tools, strategies that at the same time hide, disavow racism, and reproduce it. Instituted in 1775, the system of indentured servitude in what is now South Africa's Western Cape Province and was then the Cape Colony required children of enslaved Khoena to also be enslaved on the white master's farm until the age of 25. By the way, they called this apprenticeship, pretty deceptively, right? On April 1, 1810, just a few days after Sarah Bartman, a Khoena woman, was forcibly brought to Europe to be exhibited in London for the entertainment of white viewers, Van der Riet defended slavery for Khoena children in a letter to Fiscal G. H. Ruder, who had objected to the practice. Van der Riet goes to great lengths to convince his interlocutor that it is right to enslave Khoena children. He immediately invokes religion, arguing that Ruder's objections to slavery would make sense if the Khoena were Christians, but do not apply to them because they are heathens. That's his word. Of course, it's in Afrikaans. It's English translation, right? In this way, Van der Riet conceals the fact that colonizers shifted their approach to conversion when it suited their interests. When a 1770 law prohibited the sale of Christian slaves, slave owners in the Cape responded by stopping the conversion of slaves. The British revoked this law in 1809 after the official 1808 abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire, allowing whites to sell any enslaved person baptized or not. Discourses about whether indigenous people have souls and can be converted were used to condemn and eventually ban the enslavement of indigenous people in the Americas. However, conversion to Christianity never saved Black people from slavery, not even indigenous Black people like the Khoena. Invoking Christianity is merely a colorblind tool that Van der Riet deploys to mask and support his white supremacist agenda. In arguing that the Koina are lazy, that's his words, slothful and drowsy, and also his words, never inclined to work, Van der Riet reproduces a discourse that white people commonly deployed in the Cape and beyond. In the process, Van der Riet transforms slavery into benevolence as he misrepresents the enslavement of Koina children as a, quote, just compensation for the care and trouble that white people take in their upbringing. Van der Riet contends that freedom is a burden to the Koina and slavery is in their best interests. Koina children, he writes, are better off living with whites who care for them. White people here are, imagine, right? White people here are depicted as even better parents to Koina children than their own biological parents. As Van der Riet transforms slavers to cite Mumi Abu Jamal and Stephen Victoria into, quote, munificent and caring paternal white father figures. Just as Christopher Columbus in his first letter to the King of Spain mystifies the theft of indigenous land by arguing that the Taino, quote, never refused anything which they possessed, they were so generous in giving, right? Van der Riet disguises the kidnapping of Koina people by contending that Koina parents voluntarily give their children away to white people. The letters of Columbus and Van der Riet show that far from being a new strategy, white supremacist discourse has always relied on biologizing the behaviors of Black people and people of color. And by the way, Van der Riet gives it away pretty quickly that he understands very well that he's lying, because first he says, no, we must enslave Black people, or, you know, Hottentots, as he calls the Koina, because they won't work otherwise. And then he says, look, we're going to have a second Santo Domingo, right? Another Haitian revolution if we don't implement some serious policy. So he makes it very obvious that he understands that you need a policy to protect white interests. So in arguing that the Koina are lazy, slothful, and drowsy, and never inclined to work, I skipped the para. The letters of Columbus and Van der Riet show that far from being a new strategy, white supremacist discourses always relied on biologizing the behaviors of Black people and people of color. In portraying Black people as lazy, criminal, in need of control, unwilling to work, and having negligent families, Van der Riet's rhetorical arsenal is eerily similar to contemporary pathologizing discourses that depict Black people as being simply unfit for freedom. We see this in a lot of discussions around corruption and dysfunctional families in the US and elsewhere. Here, Van der Riet's letter shows that enduring racist myths about Black deviance, cultural deficiency, and dysfunctional families are rooted in white discourses produced during slavery and the colonial era. Even prior to the rise of Darwinism, the eugenics movement, the birth of scientific racism, and the consolidation of the biological sciences, Europeans like Columbus and Van der Riet deliberately fabricated behavioral traits and then treated these traits as the innate properties of the people they enslaved and conquered as a means of racial control. This means that what scholars have identified as a new mode of racialization, alternatively termed the new racism, colorblind racism, cultural racism, post-racialism, or the biologization of culture, actually precedes not just the birth of scientific racism, but modern biology itself. There is then nothing new in the white denial and disavowal of racism. Disavowal and denial are simply constitutive of white supremacy. Still, we should not take for granted that in South Africa, this disavowal has reached monumental proportions since the 1994 democratic dispensation, and that many white people, especially many white academics, are at the forefront of a systematic campaign of silencing racial inequality. The South African case is emblematic of a larger global reality in which white people continue to maintain control of the most prestigious institutions of higher learning. This is also the case in other settler new colonies and, of course, in Europe. This is also, white people maintain this control, among other things, by limiting the access of Black people and people of color to academia, restricting and policing the production of anti-racist scholarship, and rewarding scholars who reproduce colorblindness in their work. You can even become, you know, the dean and so on and everything. Yeah. No, I'm thinking of Crane Sodin's scholarship demonizing affirmative action, and he was actually made the head of transformation at UCT, right? Right. Since the formal end of apartheid, many South African academics and some Black academics and scholars of color have devoted their scholarship to vilifying race-based affirmative action policies, minimizing or outright denying racial discrimination, and disavowing the fact of white privilege. While disciplines with a significant impact on public policy, and I am on my way out, such as sociology, education, and economics have become leading venues for the dissemination of racist doctrines, in South African academia, no traditional discipline is immune from this phenomenon. One of the most popular strategies that various white South African scholars and some accomplices of color deploy to silence racism is shifting the conversation away from race by arguing that inequality in the country is the product of class rather than racial disparity. But this is also not a new strategy. After all, during apartheid, Steve Biko had to fend off white South Africans' argument about the alleged primacy of class over race during apartheid, just imagine. In Black Consciousness and the Quest for a True Humanity, Biko writes, quote, "They tell us that the situation is a class struggle rather than a racial one. Let them go to Van Tonder in the Free State and tell him this. We believe we know what the problem is and we will stick by our findings," end of quote. While this strategy is not new, it has become commonplace in much post-apartheid scholarship, especially Marxist scholarship. Devan Pillai's introduction in the 2018 special issue of New South African Review on Inequality is a case in point. Although the vast majority of Black people in South Africa continue to be poor, Pillai on the very first page writes that, quote, "A rising Black elite since 1994 reveals that at a fundamental level, inequality is based on class conflict," end of quote. The rising Black elite is here evoked strategically to make racial inequality disappear, no matter that the Black middle class holds no accumulated wealth. Pillai's argument is not an exception. We can find this also, for example, in Jeremy Seeking's and Nicole Natress's well-known Class, Race, and Inequality in South Africa from 2005, where Seekings and Natress deny the special advantages that white people receive, that deny that these depend on cumulative and ongoing forms of discrimination. What this means is that cumulative and ongoing means that racial inequality is not just a residue of the past, right? What is the term that is often used in South Africa? Formerly disadvantaged persons. How are white people formerly disadvantaged when not even space has been deracialized or desegregated in this country, right? The ANC is building RDP houses in the same townships, the same concentration camps as during apartheid. So today, as in the past, the silencing of racism continues to depend on disavowal and outright lies that sustain themselves through the manipulation of facts and data. Tokufu Zuberi and Eduardo Bonilla Silva call these mechanisms white methods. They show that racism impacts how social science research is dominantly conducted, starting from what questions are asked and not asked to how data is analyzed. White methods, which the authors define as, quote, "the practical tools used to manufacture empirical data and analysis to support the racial stratification of society," end of quote, cannot be disentangled from white logics, which are white ways of making sense of the world. The deployment of white methods is visible in Deborah Posel and Ilana van Wyck's response to my 2021 review of their edited volume, Conspicuous Consumption in Africa. In that review, I argued that it was conspicuous that a volume on conspicuous consumption in Africa was, quote, "completely silent about the fact that white South Africans still own over 70% of the country's land and hold almost 70% of its top managerial positions," end of quote. And it's the last page. I argued that Posel and van Wyck's introduction to the volume, quote, "silences the fact that white people continue to own the vast majority of South Africa's land, wealth, and assets to the extent that white people are wealthier now than during apartheid." I also contended that the volume frames conspicuous consumption in the African continent today as an almost exclusively Black issue, right? Corruption and Blackness put together. And finally, I concluded that, quote, "as they erase white supremacy from the contemporary South African and larger African landscape and blame exclusively the Black elite for the failure to achieve economic justice, Posel and van Wyck pathologized Black people as being simply unfit for freedom, echoing the racist argument that Rino Johannes van der Riet made in 1810, namely that Kwena children should be enslaved because freedom is a burden to them," end of quote. In attaching consumption and corruption in the present, mostly to Black people, they displace the material advantages of whiteness to the past and essentialize corruption as a Black issue. Rather than responding in an academic fashion through an article, Posel and Van Wyk recruited other contributors to the volume, which was notably dominated by white scholars, as a strategy to further silence white supremacy and direct attention away from my critique of their work and their specific contributions, demonstrating that racial disavowal continues to rely on lies and the manipulation of data. In their response, Posel and Van Wyk went as far as misquoting me. While in my review, I argue specifically that Posel and Van Wyk, quote, pathologize Black people as being simply unfit for freedom, Posel and Van Wyk write that I argue that the book, quote, pathologizes Black people as being simply unfit for freedom. The authors had no problem in adding in a direct quote attributed to me a third-person S to the word pathologize where it did not exist. In the process, they disavow responsibility for their own racism and continue to silence the material advantages that define whiteness in South Africa. Again, white wealth is nowhere to be found in this response, right? These moves are deliberate strategies of disavowal that we cannot understand through the lens of ignorance. In conclusion, it has been my contention that in their attempt to grapple with whiteness, white epistemology, and racism more broadly, scholars should pay more attention to denial and disavowal, rather than viewing ignorance as the main frame through which white ways of knowing in matters of racism can be understood. I tried to find a conference on denial, white disavowal. I didn't find it. There's many conferences on ignorance. I'm not saying there shouldn't exist, right? But I'm saying it's popular. Why is it so popular, especially in connection to whiteness and social justice? So scholars should pay more attention to denial and disavowal, rather than viewing ignorance as the main frame through which white ways of knowing in matters of racism can be understood. Even as ignorance was structurally produced by the apartheid government through spatial segregation, Steve Biko emphasized white people's awareness, investment, and disavowal in questions of racism, rather than their ignorance about racial domination. In the opening lines of Black Souls in White Skins, Biko writes, quote, basically, the South African white community is a homogeneous community. It is a community of people who sit to enjoy a privileged position that they do not deserve, are aware of this, and therefore spend their time trying to justify why they're doing so. Where differences in political opinion exist, they are in the process of trying to justify their position of privilege and their usurpation of power, end of quote. Today, as in the past, white people collectively continue to spend our time and academic resources trying to justify our position of privilege and our usurpation of power, not just in South Africa, but worldwide, not because we are ignorant, but because we understand very well that our power and privilege depends on our disavowal thereof, as has been the case for over 500 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. I mean, that was so insightful. And you've saved us some time for questions. So we've got about more than 10 minutes for questions. And I mustn't forget that we've got people that are joining online, right? Will somebody assist us in terms of getting the questions on there? Thank you very much, Prof. That was very insightful, thought-provoking. We've got about 11 minutes for questions. I have noted that we've got people that have joined us online. I presume that there's somebody that's going to assist us in terms of taking questions, if there are any online. Do we have a microphone? Are there any questions, comments? Another one. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Milazzo. My name is Dr. Nathaniel Adam Tobias Coleman. I am deeply impressed by the comments that you made regarding ignorance, denial, disavowal. It draws my mind, especially given the examples that you drew upon from the contestation over enslavement at the beginning of the 19th century. It draws my mind to the work of Professor Catherine Hall, who has been developing concepts of denial and specifically disavowal with regards to race making in Jamaica in response to anti-slavery work. So there's a book coming out on Edward Long as the producer of racial thinking, biological racial thinking in Jamaica. Thinking about Jamaica and thinking about the way in which anti-slavery went, my ears pricked up when you alluded to the description that had been given of the social status that was accorded to young children, the social status of apprenticeship. This idea that there was a possibility of education in this experience. There was a need to be in an intermediary state between full enslavement and full freedom. Of course, I think you were referring to the 1810s. It's not too long afterwards that the British do finally capitulate and say that they're abolishing slavery in 1833. What they do in 1833 is not abolish slavery, but compensate enslavers, partly with £20 million, partly with £20 million worth of forced labor, which they call apprenticeship. So my question is about this use of the word apprenticeship, the way in which it disavows what is actually going on, and to what extent do you think the use of the word apprenticeship in the early 19th century was then taken up by the British in the 1830s? What relationship is there between those two uses?
Thank you so much for that question. You know, as you were talking about Jamaica, you made me think about C.L.R. James and the Black Jacobins quotes a white planter called Edward Long, who, of course, you know, made all his wealth through enslavement and land appropriation. And then he's got this long quote with, you know, this representation of Black people are thieves, this, and this, right? All of these strategies of projection that serve to make it look normal, right? Make theft look natural. With regard to apprenticeship, I'm not exactly sure how that specific term kind of was passed on later, but I was thinking at the same time about, so after the so-called abolition of slavery in 1888, Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery, right? And Black people were almost immediately pushed out from the inner cities, for white people, the most desirable parts of Rio de Janeiro, the city centers. And what was this practice of pushing people to places like City of God, which maybe we know from, you know, television. This was later, obviously, that this, you know, favelas, places that are not very different from townships, they didn't call it, you know, pushing out Black people, they called it urban development. Now, how similar is that to the gentrification, right, and the ongoing urban development that we have today, which keeps pushing Black people further and further out to the margins of the city, right? And there's organizations in South Africa, for example, in Cape Town, reclaiming the city, that I'm not sure about the politics, but like I'm not trying to advocate for them necessarily, but what I'm saying is it's important that there are organizations that are making arguments for the importance of having housing in the city centers where there are jobs, because the townships were specifically created for, you know, for Black people to remain an exploitable pool of labor without any connection to jobs, wealth, and so on. And it continues to be this way, right? We accept that. We accept these little RDP houses that are barely like, how is this a living room, this entrance where you can barely open the door, right? And that constraint, no white people would, like, the government wouldn't put any white people in such kind of housing, and or just expect Black people to remain in the same townships and not desegregate the space. So all of these techniques, right? And at the same time, we have beautifully gentrified neighborhoods. Maboneng looks nice. And then you just cross one street and then, children are shooting stuff in their arms. You can visibly see what is going on. So, and with regard to the question of slavery, you were talking about, the abolition of slavery, even that abolition, right, being deceptive. Of course, in Brazil also, Black people were given nothing after so-called abolition. Here, slavery is sometimes, other scholars have written about this, Fumlacola and so on, how slavery is becoming more and more part of the debate, but it's almost as if it didn't happen, right? In the US, slavery hasn't really been abolished. We know about the exception clause in the US Constitution that actually stipulates that, there shall be no servitude and enslavement except as a punishment for crimes. So we know that Black and brown people who are predominantly disproportionately enslaved work for under $1 an hour even in really captive conditions in US prisons. So yeah, well, I don't know exactly about apprenticeship, but really one can think about in how many ways really still today actually, how many young Black people in South Africa, but also elsewhere are actually working for free for very rich companies through, what do they call it? Internships, right? And you go from one internship to the next and you're just expected to excel in your field and just work completely for free. And there's not even expectation that a minimum kind of wage should be given to someone who is a WITS graduate or even, so yeah, I'm not sure about apprenticeship, but it's interesting to me that already in 1810, you would think that this kind of language is kind of a recent thing, because in 1810, after all, slavery was legal, right? So why do you need this kind of language? Well, you need this kind of language to perpetuate the system. It's always been that way, right? What couldn't Europeans just saying we're stealing land? And anyways, is what they were doing. Why did they need to talk about civilizing and Christianizing? Because that's actually the history of white supremacy, right? The whitewashing of it. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I look forward to talking more. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad you brought up that thing of internship, because that's exactly what I was thinking about when the conversation around apprenticeship came up. And it was going to be a comment of mine. But further to that, when you said that, it made me think about how, my estimation of the situation is that so working for money, right, as a practice, as a concept, is also it's a white way of being. It's like a white technology, right, of how you engage the world. But the idea with
Sorry, did you say working for money?
Money. Yes.
Sure.
Yes. Which is also why when colonizers came here, they called us lazy and all of this stuff, because we just actually wanted to have fun, right? And like lay around in the sun as one does. And work for what is absolutely necessary to keep the community going, right? But the idea there with the internship, right, is you don't need money. You don't need to work for money, because what this internship affords you is a dignity that you inherently don't have. And for that, you should be grateful, right? So this, to be let into white ways of being, affords you a gateway into dignity. And so that's something you should be grateful for. But the question that I actually have, because it came up when you were speaking about innocence, right? White innocence and that construction of it. And, over time, it has, so with this, also this violent disavowal of wokeness as this, like, this thing that is destroying society. With that construction of innocence, right, which is a retaliation to that. So now I as a white person, I'm a victim of this wokeness, which is really about, first of all, illuminating the fault lines, and secondly, holding people accountable, right? But I, as someone who is engaged in social justice work, not just professionally, but also, every day of my life as a fact of existence, I don't know what to do with that, because it is so deceptive, right? where people can actually buy into this idea that white people are victimized by this process of accountability, and they perform it extremely well, and they know very well how to extract and distract, right? And demand attention for it, right? And before you know it, the entire conversation revolves around white people's victimization by accountability. And I mean, I'm also just notoriously somebody who doesn't give a shit about those feelings, right? But it's powerful. It's powerful. It has practical import. It actually achieves things. And it distracts and detracts from the work that we are trying to do, which is justice and accountability. What do we do in response to that when white people start performing this innocence that actually takes all the attention away from what is actually supposed to be happening, which is justice?
Thank you so much for that question. I was actually going to get into this in the paper and it was too long and I had to, but there was going to be a section on precisely what you're bringing up, which is white injury. So this dominant, but it's all interconnected, right? Another dominant white discourse that has always existed, but has really become, a pandemic, if I can use that term, especially, it's global, right? So, but in South Africa, it's pretty funny. Because if you read like Dan Mayer's novels, especially the Benny Griesel ones, series. Benny Griesel is this Afrikaner cop, and he drinks a lot. And, and even his therapist tells him, no, it's not your fault that you're drinking because obviously under these conditions of work. And there is this friend, Cupido, who is colored, a black policeman, and he tells him, you are fucked you are white. Oh, of course, you're feeling like this anyways, because you are white in a system of affirmative action, basically fucked. That is a quote. What is Deon Meyer saying about being white in South Africa today, right? Being a victim of affirmative action. And this is actually a global discourse because then you move to David Duke, former leader of the Ku Klux Klan turned politician, who, if you just Google David Duke white genocide, you find all sorts of white supremacist propaganda videos about how white people are being genocided in South Africa, especially on farms. And it's such common sense that very few people know actually the statistics, which is that white farmers in South Africa, in terms of crime, including murder, are safer than the average population. Okay. So, of course, Melissa Stein would know the numbers. Yeah. So, and then, Trump making the same arguments. And the Australian minister, at some point, when Ramaphosa said he was going to redistribute land, of course, it was a electoral gimmick, saying, white South Africans can come here in exile, et cetera, et cetera. So the question of injuries really, several scholars have written about it, is really at the center, especially white males, men, but not exclusively, ways of understanding themselves. And the question of, and then you also brought up the question of whiteness in conjunction with activism, right? And how that can become an additional way in which, we turn ourselves into victims. It's interesting in that essay by Samantha Weiss that I critique in an essay, my book, and how do we live in this strange place? She concludes by saying, basically, of course, I'm, paraphrasing, analyzing, basically by making the argument that addressing my whiteness, right, critiquing whiteness is actually, it may not take my whiteness away, but it's going to make me feel better about it. So even activist work, even anti-racist work is beneficial for white people when we are engaged with it. Or think about the popularity of slave narratives that during slavery, bestsellers among white readers, or even Mark Matabane's K-Boy, I don't want to say the K word, but we know what the book is titled, an autobiography from 1986 that tells a terrifying story of being a young boy grown up during apartheid, a bestseller in the United States. Why are books about Black suffering bestsellers among white readers? I think it's because they make us feel good, paradoxically. I think it's this paradoxical, okay, I can read this and feel, of course, Saidiya Hartman writes about this in Scenes of Subjection, how it's all narcissistic, right? You as a white person put yourself in the position of the slave, and that's how you empathize by this projection. And in any case, so it's this narcissistic encounter or, exercise. But, another way, on building on that, I think, you read this text and you're like, oh my God, I feel terrible for, Frederick Douglass and this enslaved man, or for Matabane, what he's going through during apartheid. I feel terrible. This is really making me sick. I need to close this book now and do some cooking. Oh, I'm a good person. Isn't that what it means? I feel bad for this person, so I'm not responsible for slavery, and I would never support apartheid policies because I'm feeling terrible about this story and these bulldozings and so on. So there's many different ways in which it's almost like a kind of a, like whether you work for or try to work against it in case it benefits you, I mean, Vice's academic career, or even like, I don't think one can think about, or like even my own, is like, there's always a reward, whether you're racist or anti-racist. As a white person, there's rewards, period, right? Especially as a white woman, we never talk about that. Because as a, I think you have a, okay, I don't want to talk too much, but I think there's ways in which white women are privileged above white men, and we never talk about it, especially when it comes to hiring. And, I think a department in South Africa might be more willing to hire a white woman than a white man working on diversity issues today. This is my opinion. And I think it's, yeah. So one day I'll write about white women in privilege, but for now, let me be quiet. People are turning their heads. Sorry, let me have a candy.
If there is any question, can I ask that becomes the last one, if you don't mind, so that we do it. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Professor. As a white woman, I'll do that work with you, because as a DEI practitioner, yeah. But to challenge it, yeah, as a DEI practitioner, someone working in corporates, working in schools, so much of what you said just resonates hugely. And I think it's very instructive also for doing that work, because a lot of DEI work is about correcting the ignorance. If we can just give a lot of information.
DEI stands for
diversity, equity, and inclusion work, which itself is problematic. But just like give people more information, give them the stats, correct their thinking, and then that will somehow shift people. And it just doesn't most of the time. And so I'm really, really appreciating your framing it as denial and disavowal. That makes the work much more real and much more challenging. And so I guess my question is, what do you do then? And it's similar to the previous question. What do we do when the denial and disavowal is so evident and so present? And then I also just want to thank you for calling out other scholars, because I think a lot more of that is also needed. You took me back to when I was at UCT and worked for Seekings actually on a project. And the lies that were told, the things that were said about our fieldwork team, and that were never named, things like when their payments were delayed, which were next to nothing anyway, like the whole internship thing, next to nothing. And then the payments were delayed, and Seekings would say things like, oh, it's fine, they don't need that anyway, they know how to survive. Just disgusting things that were permitted in the UCT context, which I'm sure are present in many universities. And so my second question is also, how do we create more channels for that reporting of what goes? So when that was said, I spoke to the research manager, but then I think this came out in our breakaway session yesterday. The reporting channels are where things get lost. So you try to hold people accountable, and the red tape and the bureaucracy to actually report these things, just things get lost in the system. And that's very, especially when I mean, that was years and years ago as a student, it's very demoralizing to keep trying to raise issues and it just gets lost somewhere. So how do we do it though? And so thank you for calling those out. And it's very shocking that they would also change your words like that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. You're bringing up also like important issues, especially around the question of teaching or the production of knowledge, right? I think, you know, we are very well aware that even more producing more knowledge, counter knowledge about racism, teaching about the stats and the numbers doesn't necessarily change the racial inequality, right? And I'm also thinking about how, for example, you know, more police cameras or witnesses, you know, ways to document police violence in the US, for example, has really not changed the fact that a Black person in the US is almost police and vigilantes. It actually produces more and more, you know, occasions for white voyeurism and spectacular consumption of black pain. So, you know, I sometimes I used. Doesn't it use a microphone? It's fine. I cannot. Okay. It's short. Thank you so much. So, you know, I used to use students the first day of class, you know, what would you like to learn in this class? And then collect some anonymous pieces of paper with their, you know, thoughts on what would they like to learn. And it would happen, especially in, you know, predominantly white classrooms. Oh, we're tired of learning about racism. You know, what are the solutions? How do we get to the solutions? And I think about, you know, I think it's Tura and Hamilton, an introduction to Black Power from 1967. I'm not sure, but I think it's them who write that, you know, in order to resolve the problem, we have to understand the problem correctly. And I think that's part of kind of the like work of academic scholarship is, and also I don't think, you know, what are the solutions? Black people have, Black radical thinkers, all the solutions are already there. I mean, if you read Biko in 1907, I mean, shortly before he died, he already said that if there's no redistribution of wealth, all that will happen is that Black people will continue to be poor and you will have a few Black people filtering into the bourgeoisie. The solutions is not for a white scholar to provide the solutions in the sense that there are already Black radical thinkers who have provided them, and the solution can never come from whiteness, right? They are there. You know, redistribute and so on and so forth, right? They have been there. So that's one thing. And finally, with regard to the question of the channels of reporting, you know, I'm always an advocate for kind of working where you are, kind of starting where you are. I don't know if you're a faculty in a department, but are there channels for reporting racist behavior among yourself and your colleagues in your own department? Is there something of an ombudsman? I know my department does not, right? So, but, you know, have we ever raised the issue? And those kind of things, like, are there ways, you know, sometimes there's even smaller things that happen in departments where, I don't know, graduate students don't receive, I don't know, the attention that they should, and there's nowhere really for them to go. And we always think, okay, you know, like there should be the chancellor or the dean or, you know, to address some of these issues. But where we have leverage, a little bit of leverage, such as in our own departments, have we ever kind of created smaller structures for accountability of ourselves and our colleagues, for example, right? So they kind of start, and then, you know, we can say, well, let's, yeah, which doesn't mean we shouldn't, you know, mess with the higher powers, but which means it's, have we created channels for reporting where we are working for a start? Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Really appreciate that. All right. Just as we were talking about the apprenticeship, I was reminded of the recent study done by, am I audible? I was reminded of a study recently done by the Department of Employment and Labor, which actually showed that Black youth in South Africa will go through an average of 2 to 3 learnerships without getting employment, but that becomes even higher for Black persons with disabilities. They go through an average of 3 to 5 learnerships and still be unemployed. That's 5 years of your life. Thank you very much.